Welcome again to the fall lecture series for 2021. I think, as most of you know, my name is Carrie Soden. I'm the Archaeological and Research Director here at the National Museum of the Great Lakes. Tonight is the second of our fall lecture series. We've made a couple of little tweaks to our hybrid program. The biggest one is, I believe, if you would like closed captioning, if you're streaming on Zoom and you would like closed captioning, you should be able to turn them on tonight. This is where I would normally begin my introduction of the talk and the speaker, but hey, it's me. This evening we're going to talk a little bit about a little tiny tidbit of history known as Bradstreets Disaster. This event took place overnight on Lake Erie in October of 1764. We recently received 2 donations of objects from this event, and with that we put together a small temporary exhibit, which we'll talk about tonight as well. But so we're going to start kind of with a little bit of history and background, and we'll talk some about the objects that we received. I do want to acknowledge that, yes, we scheduled this program for November 10th, and we put it on the calendar. We didn't think too much about it till about a month ago. We realized that this is sort of you guys are laughing at me because you thought I didn't know. This is sort of an important anniversary in Great Lakes history. It's now 7:04. At this time on November 10th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald was still afloat in Lake Superior. About 7:10, 46 years ago, the first mate of the Anderson radios to the Fitzgerald with an update from his radar and asks how they're doing. Captain McSorley at that time replies, "We're holding our own." And this is the last contact that anybody ever had with anyone aboard the Edmund Fitzgerald. 5 to 10 minutes later, the Anderson noted that the Fitz had disappeared off the radar, and finally calls the Coast Guard at 7:25 p.m. that night to let the Coast Guard know that the Fitzgerald was likely lost along with all 29 souls aboard. And we talk a lot about this in our exhibits here. We just had programs about it. But this is what happened 46 years ago tonight. So I just wanted to make sure that we did mention that is what had happened. Obviously, that's not what we're here to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about a different disaster caused again by somewhat, I don't want to say unexpected storm, because the Fitzgerald storm was unexpected, but it was unexpected for Colonel Bradstreet. But first, let's start with some background. One of the things that I got kind of interested in as I started on this research was learning more about these little pieces of history that you probably learned about maybe in early high school and then quickly forgot about, like the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. The 7 Years' War begins in 1756. It is mainly sort of this Great Britain versus France clash. But it eventually succeeds further into Europe and other places as Prussia and Portugal join Great Britain, and Austria and Russia and other places join France. They all get into the fray. The reason all of this is happening is actually what's going on in North America, because the French and Indian War actually starts in 1754, 2 years before the start of the 7 Years' War. But what's going on in Europe is really a lot about gaining and regaining lost power and property that's happened over there for centuries and centuries. And it's not really why we're here tonight. So we'll take a quick step over. The French and Indian War is really what starts the 7 Years' War. Sorry, in 1754. It is obviously a skirmish war between the British and the French and many of the French's Native American allies. It goes along, okay, let's see, this is where I get, the image on the top right is of a attack, a French and Native attack against Fort Oswego. I do want to point out, as we're talking about this, that many of the images you find about stuff in the 18th century were actually created in the 19th century. Europe, I don't want to get too far into this and too far down the road, but just know that there are definitely some biases by many of the artists. Many 18th and 19th century Europeans and Americans of European descent viewed Native Americans as, I'm using this word in quotes for sure, savages, and illustrated them as such. Today we know that these images are really an unfair projection of who they are and were, and especially allies to many people on the European sides of things. The lower image is actually a contemporary image of 3 Cherokee chiefs who's traveled to London in 1762, which is still technically while the French and Indian War is going on. But the French and Indian War, for all war purposes, ends really in 1760. The English had, over the years, slowly been separating the French and their allies in what's now Canada and cut off a lot of French frontier forts. Finally, over the summer of 1760, 18,000 British troops worked on a 3-pronged campaign headed toward and into Montreal, where finally the French sign on September 8, 1760, Articles of Capitulation, and basically they give up. It is another 3 years before a formal peace treaty is signed, again, because the French and Indian War is sort of swallowed up into this greater 7 years war. I always find it interesting to note, especially when, they fight longer in Europe, 3 years longer, and actually nothing happens. There is no change in any European territory with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. However, a lot changes in the North American continent. France cedes all of its North American possessions to the Mississippi River, including those parts of Canada, as well as some islands in the Gulf of Mexico. Great Britain, they cede all that to Great Britain. France also cedes Louisiana and its North American Western territory west of the Mississippi to Spain, which again is one of those, always knew that we bought Louisiana from Spain, but I sort of missed the point where the French owned it before even that. And Spain cedes Florida to Great Britain. So, it's almost, I want to say it's a 3-way trade, but France ends up with nothing. Spain and Great Britain end up with quite a bit. That being said, this is 1763, 3 years after the fall of Montreal. The British have actually been in charge throughout the entire way for most of those 3 years. I do want to note, they made this treaty with the Treaty of Paris between Great Britain and France and its other powers that it was allied with over there. There were no treaties at the end of the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War that were made with the French or the Great British North American Indian allies. So they just were completely kept out of the treaty process. Within it, the French citizens were allowed to stay in that French territory and worship at a Roman Catholic church. Scandal. The one thing to note on this map here is that middle section that says Indian Reserve of 1763. That eastern border heads right up the Appalachian Mountains and is sort of a zone that had been somewhat, as I said, there's no real treaties, but with them, there has been an agreement that the European settlers will not come west of the Appalachian Mountains. And that's going to become important as we start talking about what happens next. Let's talk about a couple of guys that I think are fairly important as we move on in our story. The first is a man known as Field Marshal Jeffrey Amherst. He first came to North America in 1758 and led quite a few important battles during the ongoing French and Indian War. Especially, he was leading one of those marches up into Montreal when the French and Indian War is finally finished. After that is over, he is now the Governor General of British North America. And he's the one who starts creating problems based on how he is choosing to lead and deal with the Native American communities that are within his purview. He has about 8,000 troops under his command in North America, but only 500 are stationed in the region where our next little war is about to erupt, mostly because he thought that the Native Americans were incapable of offering any serious resistance to the British Army. So just sort of think about the mindset of what we're talking about here. He also stopped something that the French were very active with, which was giving and receiving of gifts with the Native Americans. It was very much within their cultural sign of honor. Gifts were given to chiefs who were then passed out to the rest of the tribe. I believe gifts were given in return as well. Amherst liked to say that he saw that as bribery. And so he just kind of quit that. And then one of the final things that he did is he really started limiting the ammunition and gunpowder that could be sold to them. Now, why? I don't understand. If he thinks that they can't be a serious problem and he only has 500 soldiers in this greater area. It's a little back and forth on that. Finally, is also during this time, you start to see that westward movement over the Appalachians. And so this is really starting to rile up and make the Native Americans concerned and have some questions and start to wonder what they can do to make sure that they can hold their own. They don't want to be subjugated. To them, they are not under British control. They are their own people. And so this mood or this turn of events where they're being limited on things and they're being disrespected is really problematic. And a lot of what is about to happen revolves around an Ottawa war chief named Pontiac. I'm going to mention again, both of these drawings were done in the 1800s. The color one was done in 1840 and the black and white one was done in 1879. And just as a reminder, we're talking about 1760s. So nobody actually knows what Pontiac looked like. But this is all we have to really illustrate him here today. So as I said, Pontiac was an Ottawa war chief. He's born sometime between 1712 and 1725, either on the Detroit or the Maumee River. Today, Defiance, Ohio claims to be his birthplace. And honestly, really is not much known about him before 1763, when we're about to just jump into what's known as Pontiac's Rebellion or Pontiac's War. As I said, there's no contemporary images, but he is really one of the, as the leader of the Ottawas, really upset and distrustful of the British and decides that, you know, it's time to do something. They've come in, they've taken over areas that weren't supposed to be. So Pontiac finally moves on May 7th, 1763, moves in to try and capture Fort Detroit. He didn't succeed that day. A few days later, he comes back and actually lays siege to the fort and keeps that siege up until October 31st, 1763. Just because I'm an idiot, sometimes my notes say 1963. Yes, he kept siege for 200 years. No, at least I caught it and didn't say it and expect everybody to just go with me. This is still, you know, 4 or 5 months of siege is a lot to go on. Pontiac, obviously the Ottawas are with him, that's his tribe. There's several other tribes in out with him. Some are coming in and supporting for a few weeks and then maybe going away again. So finally on October 31st, he has to really sort of end the siege and he decamps and leads to the Maumee River to kind of figure things out. While the siege though is going on in Detroit, between May 16th and June 5th, 5 smaller forts are captured, including Fort Sandusky, Fort St. Joseph in Michigan, Fort in Illinois, and Fort Michilimackinac in Michigan. And then by mid-June, an additional 3 forts are taken in what is now known as Ohio. And there are lots of tribes working here together. The Ottawas, Ojibways, Potawatomis, I'm going to say all of these names wrong, Miamis, Weas, Kickapoos, Mascatoons, Pinkashaws, Shawnees, Delaware, Wyandots, Mingos. There's really a confederation working together. And I'm going to use this phrase with Pontiac. The war has been labeled Pontiac's Rebellion or Pontiac's War. Historians are really split on whether Pontiac led and outlined this whole program, you know, the siege on Detroit and then these other, these captures of these other forts, or he sort of let it be known that he was going to do it and everybody else just sort of said, yeah, we're going to do all that in our space too. It's really unknown which sort of way it went, but today it is still known as Pontiac's War. With the beginning of this war in 1763, well, this uprising, for lack of a better word, in 1763, Amherst is recalled to England. They're not super happy with him. He's replaced by this gentleman, General Thomas Gage. And so as 1864 starts, Gage is taking over and he starts working with a plan that had been developed by Amherst to send 2 expeditions out to crush the rebellion, rescue British captives, and arrest the rebellion leaders. Crush them. We're going to talk about the first expedition with Bradstreets Disaster, but I'll mention the second expedition quickly. Was run by a fellow that you can see here, Colonel Henry Bouquet, who was planned to go overland from Fort Pitt into Ohio country. He really had some problems mustering enough soldiers, though, and he actually doesn't leave Fort Pitt until October 3rd, 1764. So, and as we get into the dates, you'll see that that's way late compared to what Bradstreets ends up doing. Now let's talk about Bradstreet, the first of those 2 expeditions that were supposed to be kind of in together. Colonel James Bradstreet leaves Fort Shossler, which is up by Niagara, with anywhere between 1,200 and 2,100 men in early August 1764. This is the thing about doing research in what was sort of, I don't want to say uninhabited, but still very rural, very open, very wild country at that time. Nobody seems to have really good numbers on things. You're going to hear me give ranges of numbers on men. And I'll be honest, I will flat out throw this at the feet of COVID that we are still doing a lot of research remotely. So getting our hands on primary documents and things like that to kind of double check some of these numbers makes it difficult to do really good scholarly research and come up with okay, we know, or we think that there are 1,700 men on this expedition. I don't know, it's 1,200 to 2,100. That being said, sorry. These men are carried, they instead of moving overland the way Bouquet was gonna go, they go over water. Their purpose is to head over to Fort Detroit, reinforce Fort Detroit, subdue the uprising, and then march into Ohio country and basically create a second, basically meet up with Bouquet and come in from the rear from where Bouquet is probably, hopefully having his issues and taking care of his stuff. Sorry. Early on as they set out, strong winds forced Bradstreet to land at Fort Presqu'Isle on August 12th. This is about where Erie, Pennsylvania is. Here we go. Fort Presqu'Isle. This is one of the forts that had been captured in 1763. Bradstreet, for some reason that nobody really seems to fully understand, starts talking to the tribes there and actually negotiates a peace treaty with Gaiusata, a leader of the Senecas, who you can see here. He had been told he could negotiate truces, but not peace treaties. Part of that peace treaty is also letting Gaiusata and the Seneca know that Bouquet is about to come over land and create havoc. And don't worry, I'm gonna right back to the home base and have them call it off as part of this peace treaty. Needless to say, this doesn't go over well back at the home base. Gage and Bouquet are irate, and Gage completely disavows the treaty, basically says, not at all. Bradstreet doesn't know that they're angry. He goes on his way. I'll take a quick hop ahead of time. He does realize, though, later when he stops in Sandusky, where he's supposed to meet up with these people to have some prisoners returned to the British based upon the deal of this treaty. Yeah, they never showed up. So they weren't invested in this peace treaty that Bradstreet had negotiated with them either. Bradstreet does finally continue on to Detroit, and he arrives there on August 26th, where the British were still encamped in Fort Detroit. As I said, Pontiac had left off that siege in October the year before. And at this time, Pontiac was actually in Illinois conferring with some allies. Bradstreet again negotiates a peace treaty that he is not authorized to do. And in the middle of this, in an attempt to discredit Pontiac, Bradstreet chops up a wampum belt or a war belt that Pontiac has sent to them and during their negotiations. I think you could easily say that, you know, Bradstreet was not full of negotiating prowess. He wasn't maybe a real great ambassador for some of these negotiations. Well, not only is he not supposed to be doing it, many of the terms don't seem real, and then he goes and insults everybody just by trying to put down the one singular man of Pontiac. That being said, he does resupply Fort Detroit. He sends about 300 men overland up to Michilimackinac. There's going to be obviously some exchange of men, some that are staying behind at Fort Detroit, some that are coming back. And he heads home, starts heading back. Theoretically to, you know, the plan was at this point that he's going to go overland and meet up with Colonel Bouquet, but he's sort of going, well, I've done 2 peace treaties. There's nothing left to fight. I don't need to go overland and meet up with Bouquet. I'm just going to go right on back home to where I belong. And this is where he eventually stops in Sandusky, and he waits and waits, waits, and realizes they're not coming to release their prisoners to him. And so he moves along. He eventually, he takes his crew of men at this point, anywhere between about 1,200 and 1,500, his 60 bateaux and his 9 canoes, and continues heading on from Sandusky. Everybody says, well, what's a bateau? Well, let me tell you what a bateau is. A bateau is very similar to this. It is a flat bottom, double-ended open boat. Usually a single sail, definitely some oars. It's definitely being steered by an oar. So it's not having a set rudder per se. They ran normally 25 to 30 feet, but larger ones, probably like what Bradstreet had, were in that 45 to maybe 50-foot range. This is interesting when you stop to think about, and you start to think about the numbers. Okay, if he had, I said 12 to 1,500 guys, so let's take a little average of about 1,350, and you have 69 boats. That's 20 to 25 men per boat in a 45-foot boat in open water with no coverage in Lake Erie in October. We're now into October. Not only that, you're carrying not just the men, their packs, any supplies you have, and all of the war machine that you took with you to take care of this Pontiac's rebellion and uprising. It boggles my mind at times when you look at this and think about what it took to move all of this around. And these guys just went and got in this boat and spent, I don't know how many days on it. I can only imagine they're stopping most nights to camp and not continuing to go, because where are you going to sleep in that? So it does make for a, you know, realize how uncomfortable things were at the time, especially if you were in part of the military. So they've left Sandusky, they're headed back on October 18th, 1764. Good news, we're getting to where we finally are going to talk about it. Bradstreet and his fleet decide to overnight on a beach, which is now about 10 or 11 miles west of what is Cleveland today. It's about 2 miles west of a small river named Rocky River. There is some, again, disagreement as to he just didn't do enough scouting and decided just to stay on the beach and not go into the river. Then there's also an argument that it was dark out and he didn't want to try and maneuver in a river without enough light. You can kind of go either way with that. Anyway, so they beach about 2 miles west of Rocky River. Decamp for the night, set up their camp. And then a storm hits and the waves hit like massive, and it destroys about a third of the fleet. So 60 boats, you're losing 15 to 20, flat out dead, gone, can't handle them. Another 20 or another third is very heavily damaged. It's also noted that they lost 6 pieces of cannon ammunition, provisions, arms, and baggage. So this is a real big problem. It takes them 3 days to kind of gather up everything, make the repairs to the boats that they can, and consider moving on again. Now, as we talked about how many men were in each of these boats, you now got a lot less boats. Some guys are going to have to go overland. And so again, this is one of those, the numbers don't make sense to me. The number I read was about 150 to 250 guys were sent overland to make their way back to Niagara. That just means that all of these boats are like twice as full as they were, maybe not twice as full, but definitely you're putting another extra 10 guys into each of these boats to get back. Sources differ on what happened to the men that were sent overland. It was an arduous journey. I mean, this is all open, untouched land right along a rocky shore. Well, not rocky, sometimes sandy, sometimes both. But it's not easy. It's late October at this point. Again, depending on what you read, there was only one loss of life on the return trip, no loss of life, or half the crowd. And so it does make for some, again, there's definitely within our research on some of this, I'd like to do a little bit more and get into some more of the primary documents to see what's going on. But they do finally, at least the men that went overland finally arrive in Niagara on November 4th. I think the boats had arrived maybe a day or two earlier. No, I'm kidding, like much earlier than that. Colonel Bradstreet was, oh, hey, look, there's Bradstreet's Landing. Colonel Bradstreet was not well received upon his return to the Niagara region. He had 2 peace treaties he wasn't authorized to contract. He had lost a third of his fleet, and it just wasn't looking good for him. He did stay in the army for the rest of his life, but his forward movement up the chain of command, which had been quite significant during the French and Indian War, he moved up very quickly, slowed down quite a bit. He was never totally shunned, but he just really wasn't given a pick of a litter. I will say he did, after this time, become known for creating a system of moving supplies using bateaus and armed sailors. He's basically a quartermaster, and became really developed the system throughout the inland waterways that got most of the British Army taken care of. I will say, as we talk about contemporary, this is probably the most contemporary image. This is Colonel Bradstreet in 1764. So this is the year all of this happened. He actually had this painting made. Pontiac's rebellion is finally ended in 1765 when the British realized that they actually can't overcome the Native Americans. They can't beat them down, that they're just going to have to like try and find a way to live peacefully together. No lands are ceded, no prisoners returned, and no hostages are taken. So everything, basically they have, they've taken these forts back and forth. Nothing really has happened for it. I did find it interesting. The peace treaty, or the final proclamation, officially recognized that Indigenous people had certain rights to the lands that they occupied. And it has been called the Native American Bill of Rights, and still informs the relationship between the Canadian government and the First Nations. Because it is a treaty with Great Britain, the Canadian government definitely still has a hand in what that treaty in 1765 had to say. All right, so now we have what's happened since, right? Don't everybody look so excited. War's over. All of the wars are over. We talked about a lot of them. Rocky River, Cleveland and Rocky River are slowly populated. This is Mike, what is this, 1813? You don't remember? Okay, never mind. John sent it to me, so I thought you were part of that conversation. Anyway, so this is Rocky River in the early 1800s. There's definitely movement out there. In 1842, a severe gale created some shifting sand around the Rocky River area. And it was mentioned that quantities of gun flints, brass musket guards, musket barrels, and bayonets washed ashore. Also along this beach were found silver teaspoons and an ancient and elaborately finished sword. No idea where they are today, but they were noted in a history of the Great Lakes in 1898. So we go from there up to today. So things continue to get found. I'm certainly not going to advocate for this, but plenty of people have looked across many, many beaches with metal detectors. And I believe that's how at least one of our collections came to be, was found using a metal detector, and now the area where we think Bradstreets disaster happened. I would imagine that this isn't, that all of it certainly hasn't been found, maybe all of it on public lands. I don't know how much searching has been done on private lands. That's a whole question I chose not to get into with the donor because I didn't want to get in too much trouble. The donor of this collection, Peter Zwick, donated this to us in 2019. As I said, he's been collecting for quite a number of years. He mentions in his notes, his fairly extensive notes, that he had been collecting in I believe the late 70s and even into the early 80s and then into the 90s, but definitely not just, this is not something he had just pulled up or found recently. When he donated, we spoke a little bit about his identification process. He definitely has some conjecture going on. I point out this one note that is one of the barrel pieces that, you know, he thinks has gunpowder inside. And I'm not trying to diss anybody of their thing, but I just, as an archaeologist, I promise you it's not gunpowder in there. It's been in the sand for 250 years. It's probably some form of concreted sand, but I think, you know, I look at things like this and it got somebody interested and excited in history and interested and excited in archaeology, and they're out doing analysis that some of it is really, really good. And some of it has been very, very helpful. And then other pieces you have to just sort of say, well, maybe not. And that's okay. So let's look at some of the pieces that he did find. There are definitely a lot of gun pieces, as we talked about, or as I had mentioned earlier. On the upper left are some rifle and gun barrels, multiple pieces. And we actually have, there's 2 pieces that we used in the exhibit. There's definitely more than that. There are side plates for gun locks. Ooh, let me throw this up. I don't know anything about guns, so I had to go find this to understand what I was looking at. The side plates that we do have are actually quite small. And I don't know if they would be for a smaller gun and not necessarily a rifle, or if they have worn down. We're still kind of getting through some of that. There's 3 possible hammers here. I'm a little unsure on the identification on all 3 of these. They seem to be somewhat in the right about shape. None of them, though, have the hole for the screw or nut to go through. They could be concreted closed. They may just be some piece of scrap. I don't know. I'm not, but if you look, they all kind of have that same form with sort of a bulbular and then, you know, slightly twisting or kind of straight piece. Sorry, it's kind of weird doing this hybrid because I would normally have a pointer and pointing at you, but, or pointing and using some way to point, but you guys couldn't get the idea. The last piece here is a flash pan, which I think is kind of interesting. You look at all of these pieces, you can see that they've obviously been fairly eroded over time. There's not a lot of detail or definition. And the other thing to notice as we move forward through looking at this is all metal and stone. There is no organic material found, whether it's the wood stock of a gun or anything, or, you know, the leather of a shoe or anything like that. Organic materials are certainly, they don't last underwater, they last even less on land over that kind of time frame. So what we're looking at is a very small assemblage of what may have been lost that evening. The other sort of big section of finds had to do with actually larger guns, cannons. I found that our little collection of cannon shots very interesting. The one on the left here is actually a piece of stone. It's a perfectly round stone shot, which was fairly common at the time. The other two pieces are large and iron, and I'll be honest, I've never seen anything quite like them before. And so it's been really interesting. The piece on the right is, yes, round, but it's actually kind of flattened. And I apologize for those of you online, but take my word for it, it's kind of flat on both sides. It's not a ball, it's more of a short cylinder. The piece in the center with the slit could actually have been packed with fire and incendiary material, and was made so that when you shot it and it landed, it would then catch whatever it landed on fire as well. So it's not just creating the percussion of banging into something, but now it's actually creating the fire, creating some fire that's going to also be part of the, the destruction. Sorry, this should not be popping up. My apologies. Oh, that's not what I wanted it to do. Sorry. There we go. There we go. All right. Anyway, there were also pieces, not just the shot. Of course, now nothing's working, right? This is why you don't mess with things in the middle. There were also other pieces, parts that had to do with cannons. We see here at the top a possible small piece of bar shot. Again, it's just one of those I question a little bit, just because the attachment point, the one end, it looks almost a little too modern in that tapering and how it comes together. I'm not saying it isn't. Bar shot would have been, you would have had another identical piece on the other end as well. It was not very accurate. It was really used a lot by the Navy in close-up range to help take down rigging, kind of like chain shot, but obviously not chain, but a bar. The 1 second from the bottom, I believe, is a cannon vent cover. This is the one thing I identified, because that's important. No, I just like to brag a little bit. No, Mr. Zwick had this as something as unidentified, and I looked at that and I was like, hey, I worked on a project that I worked on an underwater project, but that took place, our home base was at a Civil War fort, and so we got to shoot off the cannon a couple of times. This is a cannon vent cover. It's lead, it sits over, so when the cannon is loaded, you definitely want this over the vent cover until you're ready to light it, so that no dirt or anything gets into the cannon barrel and bore. And so that was my big hurrah. I've added something. The piece on the bottom is a possible vent hole cleaner. I'm a little iffy about this identification. It seems a little large for that. The other thing is most vent hole cleaners were two-part. They would clean the vent hole, but they were also pointed, so that when it was time to light the cannon, you would take that pointed end that you can kind of see here, and would go down and would puncture the paper package of black powder that was in the cannon bore. And that doesn't have that. This piece that was found doesn't have that. It also, if you look at it, has quite a less erosion and destruction that we've seen on all the other iron pieces that have come forward. So there's still a little to be discussed and looked into here. The last piece, which is this large piece that's attached to a piece of wood, is a linstock. It's one of the 5 tools that you need to load, shoot, and clean a cannon. Again, I learned all this in Oklahoma, shooting a cannon. Oh, it's really exciting. You need, to clean it, you need a sponge and a worm. This is a whole nother talk, but I just like to talk about them. To load it, you need a ladle and a rammer, and then to light it, you need a linstock, which is what we're looking at here. The linstock would have the wick. As you can see, you would light the wick, and then you can step, it would be on a very long pole, and you could step far away and light that touch hole and shoot the cannon off. The wood and the rope, which is acting as the wick, are definitely were added by the finder to try and showcase better what it is. I think for long-term management, it is on display right now like this, but I believe for long-term management, we will probably separate these out. The screws are going to be of a different metal, and storing that long-term is not good when you have two different metals up next to each other. It creates problems. We'll just go with that. There were a few non-military finds. The one here on the top is some form of a tool head. I'm looking for information if anybody knows what kind of tool it may be. I'm not 100% sure yet. The one on the bottom is definitely a trunk latch. Again, this to me was, I think, the most exciting piece. I like things that can be tied possibly directly to people. I mean, whether this is probably not a soldier they're carrying packs, but somebody's chest, or this is the chest that they carried the provisions in, something that's a little more human than guns and cannonballs and stuff. So the chest latch to me is kind of the piece that I enjoy most from this. And here's just, you can see something similar. Obviously it's definitely worn down. And again, no organic material. The chest may have been made out of wood. It may have been some kind of strengthened leather or some kind of, no, that's probably that. That's probably about it. They have a couple other pieces. One that we have put on display is really interesting. It's the piece that you can see here. Mr. Zwick believes you can see a fleur-de-lis in two different points in some of the carving and such that's there. There were former French citizens at part of this expedition as part of some of his provincial soldiers. And so maybe it came with one of them, and that's where you're getting the fleur-de-lis from, if you can see it. I'm struggling to see it. So we looked at this piece a lot, just, kind of talking about it. And I will admit, this is one of those, sometimes you just have to look at things with a new eye, because all of a sudden one day I glanced at it upside down and realized it looks like a bird. And now I can't unsee it. I will tell you, we are looking at two different sides. So it is highly decorated on both sides, which I find to be really interesting as well. It's definitely, Mr. Zwick had kind of identified this as maybe a gun plate, a rifle, one of the plates for the side of the rifle, but that would not be decorated on both sides. There wasn't a need for that. Now I look at it, all I can see is a wind vane, but I know it's not that either. And sometimes you have to find a way to step back from that to be able to look at something new. But this is our mystery piece for our exhibit. So if anybody has any ideas on this, please feel free to let me know, and we can certainly talk about it, because I would love to figure out and find out how this goes a little bit more. We do have a few other items that aren't on display, mostly because we ran out of space, and some of them, the identification couldn't be verified. So here on the left, they were labeled as finger lamps. I've never seen a finger lamp look like this. Again, they're also not nearly as worn or degraded as the other pieces that we're finding. They do seem to be more possibly with some kind of copper in them, but they would still have some severe degradation if they were from 1764. I don't know 100%. The piece on the right on the top was labeled as a partial rammer, so like a rammer for a rifle or a musket. And Mr. Zwick noted that he found it at the end of a pipe. Now this is where I love reading notes about people too. He also noted that he talked to an expert, and the quotations are his. It's in the notes. I talked to an expert, and he said that these kinds of pipes could be found, they were parts of gas burners and could be found in a Sears Roebuck catalog. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is always fun reading field notes from other people as well. The piece on the right on the bottom is a piece of flint that Mr. Zwick swears has a carving in it. So we're keeping it. I gotta look at it some more. I need to find maybe a geologist or something to look at it and say, no, this is natural erosion, or no, man carved something into this. So that's what Mr. Zwick gave us. But sort of the highlight of the exhibit outside of the trunk handle, that's just me, is this small swivel gun. This was found by a gentleman named Paul Reynolds in the 1960s, early 1970s, just off the coast of Rocky River. He did create the wood stand you see, and the little thing of balls are totally fake. It looks impressive. It's actually not that big, but don't get me wrong, it's still impressive. The bore of the cannon is only about 1.75 inches. Those two other larger cannon shots that I showed you were 4 and 4.5 inches in diameter. Swivel guns like this, when I say swivel, you can see it's on a spindle. It gives you a very wide arc to use it. But they were used a lot on naval vessels, especially as anti-personnel. They used them a lot with grape shot. So as you got in close, you could put grape shot in it and basically spray the decks of the other one. There's a part of me that's going, okay, if you're in these open bateaus, they are not really reinforced, I don't believe, to take, most bateaus would not have been reinforced to take a gun like this. So this may have just been part of that war machine that Bradstreet was carrying with him to, as he was trying to subdue the uprising that was going on. It is exciting. It does, like most cannon, have markings on it. It has the British broad arrow right there, as well as the weight. And the weight, so you can see it says 1-1-23. So the first one is for the 100 weight, which is about 100, which 100 weight now is 118 pounds. The second is the 1/4 weight, so 28 pounds. And then the third number is the extra pounds. And so if you add all that together, we're looking at about 163 pound cannon. And having picked it up, yes. Yeah.
Is that spike on the end?
Oh yeah, okay, so for those of you online, he was asking if it was spiked on the end. Mr. Reynolds put a little wooden plug in it. He did tell me that there was a piece of wood in the end when he found it. It obviously didn't last, and he sort of recreated what he thought he found. Most cannons, especially in naval instances, would have some kind of wooden plug or cap so that water didn't get inside. And I can't imagine, even if these aren't mounted and being used, you wouldn't have that same protection, so that the inside of your barrel doesn't corrode and have problems that way.
Is that the British fly arrow that's on the marking?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's definitely a British cannon.
Yep.
Swivel gun.
Swivel gun, yes.
And they did carry them commonly on Bateau then.
They did?
Yeah, they did.
That's a heck of a boat.
Wow.
So for those of you, again, online that can't hear me, our good friend Mike Spears, who's in the audience tonight, let me know that the British did actually did carry swivel guns on bateaus. And I just kind of...
When Captain Dalyell got to Detroit to reinforce Detroit, he was firing swivel guns from the Bateau, but he was half off the side.
Oh, okay. Yeah, it doesn't, you're right, it doesn't look like it's big enough, but
This is a little heavy but some of the Bateaus were 40, like you said.
we're at 45 foot, maybe. There's enough, I'm just sort of thinking about what the reinforcement would take for those sides for something that heavy to be sitting up on a cap rail like that. But I mean, maybe they are specialty built on, and those cap rails are not insulated, but
They probably figured that out and probably developed some type of a mounting piece.
right.
That will take care of that.
Okay, so there we go. Maybe it did come off the boat. Maybe they were using it. I love learning new things, especially when I make bad assumptions. I will say, so Paul Reynolds' wife, Sandy, donated this to us in late 2018 or early 2019. And I mentioned to her at the time that he had actually called and talked to me I want to say in September or October of 2004. And I started on September 1st, 2004. To talk to me about this canon. At that time, I had no idea what Bradstreets Disaster was. I could barely tell you anything about the Edmund Fitzgerald at that time. I was so new. So he talked to me about it, and that it was on display in his dive shop in Broadview Heights. And you know, he was really interested in making sure that it ended up in a museum at some point. And as I said, I was just a little overwhelmed, and I will admit that I kind of let that contact slide. Fortunately, he made his wishes known to his family, and like I said, his wife Sandy called me to discuss it as a possible donation. I will admit, it's a big piece. It's heavy. I went over with my tiny little white hatchback, and well, she had her very nice young grandson who was a bodybuilder pick it up and put it in the car for me. And my car went whoop, like that. So we got all of these artifacts, like I said, in 2019, and we were really very excited about it. This is a story, and these artifacts are really older than almost everything that we have in this building. I mean, 1764 is really early period for European style stuff on the Great Lakes. And so we knew we wanted to be able to help tell this story. And we'd been talking for a while about the idea of telling not the gales of November, but the gales of October. And we would start with the Bradstreet story as part of this Gales of October temporary exhibit that we were going to put up in fall of 2020 in October of, yeah, well, we all know what happened there. And so we finally decided to do it again this year. And again, we were talking about doing it. And for those of you that don't realize, when we do temporary exhibits, we do it in about half of the community room. So the room that we're sitting in today, we take the room and cut it in half, and we make half of it temporary exhibit. That makes having programs, having meetings, having all other kinds of things very, very difficult. And so we started discussing, you know, we really want to highlight the Bradstreet section of it. And would we be losing that if we tried to pull it in with everything else within the Scales of November? And so we decided, you know, let's make this a micro exhibit, which is what we did. So instead of having a several hundred square foot, it's just a very small footprint. There's the gun sitting on the floor. There's 3 banners and a very tall case with all the small pieces in it. I will say here, just as a little plug, this is an ongoing problem that we can't put in temporary exhibits on a regular basis. Ergo, as we all learned in the spring lecture series, we are talking about an expansion that will feature a 1,400 square foot space specifically for temporary exhibits. And I think that'll be really, really great when we can get there. I will say it's when you put an exhibit like this together, it's really difficult. I mean, we went through a lot of history here tonight just to get to that one evening. And so how do you tell all that in a very condensed way? You research, you write, you edit, you do it again, and then you edit like 4 more times to get it all in a something that's bite-sized, for lack of a better word. And so it took a little bit of time. I mean, you know, I certainly didn't do it on my own, but worked with all of my colleagues. Ring Lardner, who's our new collections coordinator, certainly helped quite a bit with it. And Ellen and Kate definitely worked a lot with some of the editing. And so it's there. And the other nice thing about this concept of the micro exhibit is the fact that because we don't need the space here, we can actually leave this up for quite a while. Normally we put up a temporary exhibits 6, maybe 7 weeks at the most. We're going to leave this micro exhibit up well into the springtime, I believe, because we can, and it's adding more knowledge and more stories that we're able to tell in our museum. I am going to finish tonight with just one sort of offshoot, not offshoot, but for myself. I was actually in 2020 sitting in my home office when I received a phone call, and this lovely woman says, "Hi, you know, my name is Pamela Booth. I'm the mayor of Rocky River." And she wanted to talk to me as a nautical archaeologist to know what a Bateau looked like. They were redoing Bradstreet's Landing, the park that they have there. So that's kind of what we're looking at on the right is sort of this idea of what this new park is going to look like. And I mentioned to her, oh, yeah, I know who you are. You're my man. She says, what do you mean? I thought I called a museum in Toledo. I said, no, actually, I'm sitting in my home office in Rocky River talking to you right now. And it was actually really, really great because basically we have this micro exhibit and we already have some place to share it with. So when the new Rocky River Park is done, we are going to share this exhibit with the community of Rocky River. It may end up in the library, it may end up in their community center somewhere, but it's already taking something that we've put together and sharing it with somebody else and sharing it in other communities, and especially sharing it in the community that it came from. So the whole experience as a whole has been really fascinating, learning all of this history that, like I said, I may have learned at 13 and forgot, but also changing how we think about doing exhibits and putting them together. So, and that's what I have for tonight. All right, questions, comments, concerns?
Who owns the cannon?
I do. No, National Museum of the Great Lakes does. Me. Take it home with me at night. No. Yes, Mike.
Another point for research, the British weapon of that time period is called brown bess.
Yes, the gun, you mean, like the rifle.
Right.
Yeah.
The musket.
Yes, musket. Again, not a gun person. I know there's a difference between rifles and muskets and other things. So you got the extent of my knowledge here tonight.
A couple questions from the virtually.
Okay.
One of the questions came in while you were on the slide with the shot.
Okay.
Asking if it's possible that the flattened ones happen because of water waves and.
Okay. So the question that came in from online is, did the flattened shot basically get eroded because of the water movement? I would, based on how it is shaped, I would venture to guess no, it wouldn't be that even per se, because it really is sort of an even, slightly rounded on both sides, but fully round in the other dimension. So I think it must have been something purposeful.
And the other, it was more of a thought about the tool that you mentioned, not knowing what it was, the possibility that it had a keyhole in the bottom was a lock. It's above your.
Yeah, no, I know. Huh. I'll have to think about that. No, yeah, sorry. I always forget. There was a comment about the tool head that I had shown and whether or not it was tell me again, a lock with a keyhole in the bottom. I will have to look at that some more. Whoever made that suggestion, if you want to email me a picture or something of what you're thinking about, that might give me a little bit better start for what I'm looking at. So, yes, sir.
On the earlier presentation, you had a lighting on Appalachian Mountains. Some kind of treaty keep us folks from migrating west of the Appalachians. I guess obviously the Indians lost that war by thousands of settlers that just moved in and took over, right?
Right. So the question is asking about, from one of those earlier maps, and I pointed out that the Indian space that was just west of the Appalachians, and that the Europeans were really not supposed to go west of the Appalachians.
That was called the Royal Proclamation of 1763.
Right.
It was the watershed of the Appalachian Mountains.
Right.
The west
That's all
side
part of it, what's in the Treaty of Paris as well. Part that the westward movement definitely was part of what Pontiac and the rest of the tribes that were with him were upset about, not just sort of the way that they were being treated, but also that this sort of agreed upon boundary. And again, like I did mention, there were no direct treaties with them, but there were some agreements, and this agreed upon boundary was not being honored in any way. I mean, even though it's written into an agreement in 1763, there's people moving in that direction well before then as well. So yeah, it's just like,
The French came in much smaller numbers, which didn't bother the Indians, and the Indians had access to the French or European market goods.
right, and that's part of what we're talking about. That I didn't get that far into it. When we call it the French and Indian War, it's not the French versus the Indians. It's really more the French and Native Americans versus Great Britain.
The French had maybe 50 or 60,000 people in North America around that time. The British had about 1 million on the East Coast. That was the difference.
No, it is a big, and again, it's not only do they have less people, but, and we talked about when Amherst takes over, they were respectful of they were somewhat respectful of their traditions, with whether it's trading in gifts or meeting them halfway, they, treating them with respect. There's a lot of differences between these things, whether the French, how many people the French had, and then how the British were treating them, and how movement west was also going. So a lot of these are problems that, again, like I said, French and Indian War ends and Pontiac's rebellion is there basically that exact same year. So
There's a lesson there, and that is we only get to keep our goods today because of our military and our police forces. Yay, veterans.
yes.
And the Indians were highly dependent upon European goods by that time. They had lost their ability to make their own clothes. They lost some of their ability to use the bow and arrow. And so,
Right, they've been introduced to the gun, and again, this is some of what Amherst had done, was cutting off their access to ammunition and shot, meaning you now can't hunt as well, especially if you've moved away from the bow and arrow tradition and you don't know how to use them, for sure.
Amherst told all the troops, do not give the Indians gunpowder, but the post commanders still did, because they knew the Indians were dependent. That's really what precipitated the war, was not getting gun. The Pontiac War is not getting gunpowder.
Right.
Do we want to, we've got a couple other people with thoughts on what things are.
Okay.
Do you want to share maybe your email address and let people know to?
Yes. So if you have ideas on some of these unknown items that we looked at, whether it's the bird, not bird, weather vane, not weather vane. I don't know what else to call it. Or something else. You can send them to our collections coordinator, Ring Lardner, collections@nmgl.org. And he and I could talk about those and look some more into them, and then hopefully be able to give you guys some kind of an update, whether it's like this or maybe via an email or an Inland Seas article in the future. So now normally this is where I would step back up and say, thank you so much, Carrie, for being here. Oh, you're so very welcome. I will let you guys know our next fall lecture series is on December 1st at 7 p.m. Bruce Lynn from the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society will be our speaker with a presentation entitled Braving the Waves, Life-Saving Service on the Shipwreck Coast. For those of you that may already be registered to join us in person, we have had a slight change. Bruce will not be able to join us in person himself and will be presenting via Zoom. However, as we continue to figure out how our hybrid programs are going to work, we're going to actually try and host a watch party here. If you'd like to come and hang out with your fellow Great Lakes enthusiasts, and I'll watch Bruce Lynn present together on our giant TVs. So hopefully you will join that. And if you don't want to come here, you can always sign up and join the Zoom. The other program that we do have coming up next week is our History Happy Hour. That's next Thursday on the 18th, where we get to come into the museum, have a couple of drinks, and we're going to talk about rogues, radicals, and rebels. I may have said that in the wrong order, but it's going to be a lot of fun. We had our first one this summer up on board the Schoonmaker, so now we're doing it in the museum this fall, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. We're working with Toledo Spirits to provide some of the libations. And so it'll be a lot of fun. You can find information about that on our webpage and get tickets at Eventbrite. As always, if you're not a member, now is a great time to sign up to become a member. You can do that at nmgl.org/membership. Thank you guys for everybody who's been here with us tonight, here in person and online. I'm so happy to have all of you. And we will see you all again in 3 weeks. All right, thanks.